to be here to talk to you. I was born in 1925 in Irvington, New Jersey, just outside Newark, of parents that were born in Italy. That makes me a first-generation American, Italian-American, which I must mention immediately that 1 million of us Italian boys with Italian blood were in the U.S. Armed Services in World War II. My brother Joe, you've heard of G.I. Joe, was in 5 years. He's older than me. He joined up before Pearl Harbor. Anyhow, at 17 in high school, Irvington High School, there was an examination to determine boys that wanted to enlist soon. And it was like an IQ exam. In the upper right-hand corner was A, letter A, and B. B for Navy, A for Army. I circled A because I wanted to go into the Army Engineers. Why? Because my older brother, had graduated from Stevens Institute of Technology in 1935 to become an engineer. He took me to Stevens several times because he enjoyed showing his place. Anyhow, so I passed the exam and enlisted at 17 years old in the U.S. Army. Soon I was sent to Syracuse University to become in the Army Specialized Training Program. I remember going to Grand Central Station. My father brought me. I was 115 pounds, and his baby boy already had an older son in the Army. It must have been sad for him. He had been in World War I, not overseas, though, however. I remember trying on his uniform with a high collar, Army uniform. So we did 1 semester of physics and map reading, and then we turned 18 years old. We went on active duty, U.S. Army, getting the serial number and going down to Fort Benning, Georgia, TIS, the infantry school. And there we had infantry training, very vigorous and interesting. I was in my platoon, by the way, I was the second from the shortest. Shorty Pierce was the shortest. Pagano was next short. But anyhow, we never dropped out of a march. In fact, one time I remember 25 miles in 2 days. And the lieutenant looked at my feet, and I had blisters on them. And he said, "You can go back to camp on the truck." I said, "No, I want to." So I persevered and went to 25 miles. And Shorty Pierce did too. In the middle of this training, they ceased the Army Specialized Training Program because they realized the war now was 1944, would not last much longer. They needed more bodies than brains. And so that was terminated. Then we were transferred then to Fort Jackson, where I became part of the Third Army, which eventually was in the Battle of the Bulge under General Patton, who, by the way, had trained at times in Fort Benning. That's another story. So anyhow, from Fort Jackson, I was in the 87th Infantry, which ended up in the Battle of the Bulge. It went over in October, we did, October 44 to England and then Normandy after D-Day, a few months after D-Day. And the 87th Infantry was placed in a quiet section of the front lines in the Ardennes. But that's where the Germans went through and conquered Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and France. I was part of I was transferred to a combat engineer battalion, 1255th Combat Engineers. And being interviewed by the captain in the engineers, he said I should go to H&S. H&S was headquarters and supplies. In other words, I was a little boy, and he figured I'd be best there. But in thinking it over, I asked the sergeant, I'd like to talk to the captain again. Why? I said, Captain, my grandparents are being held hostage in the village where my father was born, near Salerno. And Salerno, you know, is where the Americans landed trying to get up the boot of Italy to get to Rome. In fact, after the war, I learned that they blew up the house where my father was born to block the road. Anyhow, the captain hearing this, he said, I'll take you into A Company, but you know, A Company is the first one to go into battle. So a week later, I got called by the sergeant to go down to the motor pool. Why? To make me a Jeep driver. I never had driven before. My father never had a car. So I became a Jeep driver. The Battle of the Bulge began before Christmas in December 1944. And we were called over to Normandy shortly after Christmas. The Germans broke through our lines in the Ardennes. The Ardennes is a forested region between Luxembourg and Belgium. It's supposed to be a bad area, but there are many two-lane roads through there. Anyhow, the Germans went through there in 1870 and beat the French and ended up in Paris, and that's where the German Empire was declared, that united all the German little states. Anyhow, then they went through in 1940, the same area. And then they went through in the Battle of the Bulge, where the 87th Infantry was a new division that went over with us in October 44, was placed. So after the war, there's a cemetery we visited outside Luxembourg City with General Pattonsberg. And there, the first time I've seen Stars of David. You don't see Stars of David often, but they were buried there. These are Jewish boys that joined with me, bright Italian boys, bright Jewish boys in the Army Specialized Training Program. The Navy kept their program, but they terminated the Army. Anyhow, we crossed France, and one time I remember driving my Jeep and looking up toward evening, and there was the Reims Cathedral, going by Reims Cathedral. So then we hit the front lines and behind the infantry. Engineers were behind the infantry. Our battalion suffered 12 dead and 50 wounded, much less than the infantry did. But I must recall, 2 medics we had, one died, and I knew him personally. In fact, I saw him when he was wounded, offered him a ride in my Jeep, but he refused. He died a week later. So I'm one of those 12 boys that died and remained at 19, 20 years old. The oldest was 26, a fellow Jeep driver. So the Battle of the Bulge actually ended, I think, January 25th. But we kept doing engagements and liberated the biggest town in Luxembourg after Luxembourg City, called Vianden, Viandian, which has a castle there, which is the pathway where, I guess, the communication between East and West, the Luxembourgers and Belgium were. Before the war ended, we found ourselves on the Roer River, which is the river before the Rhine River. And one day the captain said, "Come on, Pagano." And the sergeant and he and I drove to devastated areas to Cologne. And here I am looking over Cologne, and I recognize Cologne Cathedral because St. Patrick's on Fifth Avenue, where I grew up, is copied after Cologne. Of course, it's only about 1/10 the size of Cologne Cathedral. And there was smoke coming out of the ceiling, the roof of the Cologne Cathedral. After the war, we went for a reunion, and I asked the guide that took us in Cologne Cathedral, why was smoke coming out of that cathedral? He said they had tied trunks of trees around the columns to preserve, but 3 English bombs inadvertently dropped to the roof there. Then, looking up, I saw General Hodges coming, and a colonel came up to us and said, what were you men doing here? So our captain muttered, and we got out of there. But then I recalled that the First Army, I learned later, was supposed to cross at Cologne at the Ludendorff Bridge that had collapsed. But they found the Remagen Bridge near Bonn, and that's where we crossed. And when we got there, the bridge had fallen. But I must relate that I saw my first jet plane swooping by, being chased by P-38s and P-47s. And I got to jump ahead that many years later in California, I met that man. That man was a young man named Hans. and he flew that plane. And there was a November 11 dinner, Veterans Day, and I invited him. And he came. Now this goes up, this is not following the relation, but it's interesting that the general at the dinner said, each of the veterans stand up. Army, I stood up. Navy, Marines, Air Force, Hans, you were in the Luftwaffe. He proudly stood up. But they're going back to crossing the Rhine River. One pontoon bridge was up when we got there. And I couldn't get up the hill, little hill, to get on the pontoon bridge. I only had 6 inches clearance on my Jeep. The captain jumped out because there was a bulldozer coming to us to push us away. We were holding up the rest of the army crossing the pontoon bridge. So, but by him jumping out, I got a little lighter, I guess, and got up onto the pontoon bridge. And then we ended up in the middle of Germany, a town called Gotha, Gotha, where incidentally, near there came Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, was a German princess that came from that area. And she acclimated herself in Russian, learned the language and everything. And you know the history that she took over from her husband, who was emperor, who was the czar, because he was but feeble-minded, and she got friendly with the soldiers in Moscow and got to be empress. And she didn't want her husband to be killed, but inadvertently he was, and she became fully empress of Russia. Another point about the Jeep is I was sitting on 15 gallons of gas. To load the gas in the Jeep, you flip up the seat and load the gas. He was sitting on 2 bags of sand. But luckily we never hit a mine. But and I must mention, I held up my end, and after the war, he gave me a Bronze Star. So I kept faith with him that I want to do more for the war because of my grandparents. There were 6 siblings. My father was one of the 6 siblings. In those days, they didn't die because of Pasteur and other scientists. They didn't die from bad water or sewage. So half of them came here. My father and two brothers. Two brothers and an aunt stayed in Italy. So that's where my father came from, a village behind Vesuvius. Pompeii, you know, is buried because the wind blew that way. But behind Vesuvius, my father's village did not get buried.
Did you decide to become an OBGYN while you were in the Army?
No, in fact, seeing many German boys, mostly young boys, and older German men killed and wounded, and then American boys wounded and dead, I thought about medicine. So when I came back after my first year of college, I went back in the Army. You can do that as a veteran, and chose to be a corpsman to see whether I liked medicine. And I did. I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, was a corpsman, and came back and took then pre-med and graduated Seton Hall. Oh, we graduated in 1950. Joe Murphy was in D-Day. Bill Nessler was in Pacific Marines. I was in Battle of the Bulge. We dissected extra cats to get A's and B's to go to medical school. But we did not get into medical school because we applied to many American colleges, but New Jersey had no medical college. So we had to apply to others. Why did we not get into the medical school? The Korean War began June 1950. We were applying to medical school. So naturally, many boys, American boys, decided to go into medicine to avoid the Korean draft. There's no medical school in New Jersey. So we had to go back to Europe, which we did not like to do. We did not like to go to a foreign country to further our ambitions to become physicians. I went to Rome because I had relatives in Naples, but I had a defect. The Jewish boys I met on board ship learned the real Italian. I had to forget the Sicilian that my mother spoke to learn Italian. But we got our MDs after 5 years, entered in their 6-year course in their second year. And we came back and finally got into American Medical School, Albany Medical College, as an MD. Well, then I became interning and had to take the New York State license. My wife was a dietitian. She got $150 a month. They only paid me $50 because the law said I had to do 12 months interning, in other words, servitude, to be eligible to take the exam. It was very difficult because the American boys take the first part of their 2-day exam after their second year. I had to take the 4-day examination in one time after I had my MD these 2 years before. So I had to be very difficult. But I passed and got my license. And then I became a general practitioner. But then after in practice, I was getting $125 delivering babies. The obstetrician was getting $250. I said, Tony, you should specialize. I had 4 children by that time. So I practiced part-time, even made house calls in Harlem before Martin Luther King was killed. And nobody bothered me because I visited many nice old couples as a general practitioner, general practice, while I was taking my 3-year OBGYN training in a big Jewish hospital in the Bronx.
I would love to capture a gem that you could tell us about.
You know, crossing the channel into Normandy, I knew we were not going to lose the war. There I saw hundreds of tanks, jeeps, and they gave me a number. I picked out my jeep. And we patrolled, by the way, for a while along the coast because the Germans were still on islands in the English Channel. And I remember the Army tires are balled in the middle. They have cleats on the side for traction in mud and snow. But in training in Fort Jackson, I remember I let up on the Jeep on the gas one time, and I spun around on a recently wet black pavement. Luckily, nothing happened. But the same thing happened during the war. I remember we were packed in the Jeep with a flapping canvas top, patrolling along the coast, and they had cobblestones there. Cobblestones are smooth building blocks for the road. And here I had 3 men packed in with me. And I let up on the gas, and I spun around, heading toward a stone house. Luckily, we completely spun around. And also, of course, during the war, I remember one time hearing a artillery shell come, and I jumped out. And I jumped back in. There was a hole on the right side of my Jeep in front of the passenger seat with a shrapnel that came in the back of my seat that almost perforated the metal back. I dug it out after the war. Shrapnel from the German 88 millimeter shell. So that had my name on it.
Do you still have it?
I gave it to one of my daughters, but she lost it. I drilled a hole in there and put a chain on it, but she lost it. It was about 1.5 inches by a half inch. After the big battle, where most of us died and were wounded, the medic said, "Pagano, you want a Purple Heart?" I said, "No, I had no bleeding," but I recalled I had pains in my shoulders because I had a steel helmet on. And walking along the road, the German and Luxembourg shingles were heavy clay, and they would fall on us from the shells dropping down around us, which incidentally, I discharged in 10% hearing loss. And getting discharged in Fort Dix, they said, "Pagano, you have 10%. So what's that? Another day of paperwork." I said, "No, my father's waiting for me in Pence." So for 70 years, I never took that 10% disability until recently. But getting back to the battle there, I remember sheltering under my steel helmet. But another significant thing recalling now, Ron, is that driving up the cobblestone road, back up away from the river where the Germans were shooting at us, were very slippery and muddy, and here I had a couple of wounded guys with me, and very carefully and fearfully, not wanting to slide back to the view of the Germans across our river, OUR River, which is only about 10 yards wide, but a real river. So luckily I got up the hill. I had a DNA test done a few years ago.
Okay.
And my mother is from Sicily, my father's from near Naples. And my father's parents, ancestry, the Italian Peninsula. But my mother is from the Middle East and Greek. And somebody, a man probably, came from Nigeria. So I have Nigerian blood. And one of my sisters had curly, kinky hair. One of my sons had an afro in high school. So we still have Nigerian blood from 500 years ago. Yeah, well, the interesting thing is I visited Italy several times after I retired, and visiting Amalfi. Amalfi used to be a trading port, but then it lost out. Anyhow, my grandfather, as a 15-year-old, became an apprentice at Amalfi. That's where he met his wife. Anyhow, he was called. The first thing they had to do was a simple thing, making the steps. Amalfi has a lot of steps to the cathedral. And that was called scalino. Scala means step in Italian. You know that you heard about La Scala in the opera house. Anyhow, he was Scalino. And their derogatory term to fellow Masons was, you're a Scalino. But he got to be, I remember seeing the statuary he did of he did a beautiful baptismal fountain for his village church. And I visited there after the war. The village, before they just had a simple excavated for baptism, water. Yep. That beautiful carved baptismal fountain, very carved, was behind a screen. Ironically, they didn't use it. They didn't want to expose that, so they didn't use that beautiful baptismal fountain because it was too beautiful to use. My parents had grade school education. They could read and write in Italian. My father became a citizen here, took it legally. By the way, between 1890 and 1910, 20 million Italians came here. So, but now about the immigrants, I think it's good too, though, because our birth rate went down. When I was practicing, it was over 4 million. Now it's way below 3 million. So maybe some bad people are coming in, but a lot of good people, like my parents, came here. And at that time, the law was the wife became a citizen because my father was a citizen. But before the war, I mean, remember something now. Mussolini and the Italian newspaper in New York, Il Progresso, had pictures of Italian immigrants that were here to donate money to La Patria. And my mother and father, my father didn't want to do it, I heard, but my mother, they gave their gold rings to the La Patria, which then was invading Ethiopia. They were rewarded by metal rings that I saw later on were rusted.